Okay, so it's 10:30 on my end. I say we start this off. Well, first of all, thanks for coming. For people who are here live on a Saturday morning, we're going to talk a little about automated testing and see if it can help you get you up and running doing those for those that want to help out and contribute to Drupal core. Let's see. So first, a little about me. I'm Len. I'm Len Dude on Drupal.org. I'm one of the senior Drupal devs at Instructo, and plus that, I do some work for Drupal core. I was one of the initiative leads for the PHP Unit initiative, and I'm currently one of the maintainers for the Views module in Drupal core. So that's where I spend my free time on. So let's see what we're going to look at today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about setting up your environment if you want to run some tests. I'll not get into real specifics, and I'll show you a little later why. I'm going to look at different types of tests that you have available when you're working on Drupal and Drupal core specifically. So before you can start writing tests, you need to know what type of tests you want to write to start with. And then I'm going to give you a short intro into writing tests, specifically looking at still when to use which test. I can't go into too much depth about how you need to write tests because that would take much more than the hour that we have. I'm going to show you some random stuff that I learned while working on Drupal core and working on writing tests. And maybe we'll have time for questions, but I'm not sure how much time we're going to have left, but we'll see. If you have any questions, just put them in chat. I don't have a moderator, but we'll look back later. And if there are any questions, just shout them out. And I'll probably get to them at the end. So first, before you can start writing tests, you need to set up your system so that you can run tests. If you need to write your tests locally, you want to test them locally that they work. But unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to developing locally, and so there's no one-size-fits-all solution to setting up your testing environment locally. What I would recommend is when you are setting it up, just look at the docs that are available on Drupal.org. And there's some more in the README file on testing. When you check out Drupal core in core/test/README, where you can find some more stuff about setting up locally. Personally, I just use a local web server and database just because that's what I'm used to and it works for me. But I know there's a lot of Lando and Docker recipes out there that are available to you to try and set up. There's a couple of good ones there. Some of the recipes might be a little bit outdated, but that's usually the fastest way to get up and running if you don't have any setup yet. And if you have no preferred way of working, using either Docker or Lando can really get you up and running fast. But like I said, unfortunately, no one true way of doing it. So this is just something that you're going to have to get through. If you are serious about starting to write tests, then that's just something you're going to have to work through. There's some common steps, though, no matter what you use. And running tests on Drupal will start off with your PHP Unit XML, which is where you tell the testing system about your setup. There's a template called phpunit.xml.dist in the core folder that you can use as a template. So to start off, you would need to copy and save that, and then you can start running tests for core. But you do have to modify it and make it match your setup. In the next slide, I'm going to go in a little bit more depth, just show you what to expect there. But very important to just read carefully when you're customizing, because most of the documentation that you need is there, but not everything might be as accessible as it could be. When you set up, the best way to test your setup is just take a core test and run it. It should be green. Since the Drupal core test suite should always be green, if you can run a core test and it works, then you know your setup works. And if it fails, then there's probably something wrong with your setup because the test should always be green. When you're setting up, when you do a Composer install, it should install most of the things that you need. Most of them come from Composer packages. Except when you want to run JavaScript tests, you're going to need to install some extra things along the lines of Selenium standalone server or Chrome driver or both, depending sort of on how you want to run your tests. But that's really only once you get to the JavaScript testing. Don't be afraid to ask for help. A lot of people have a hard time setting up their testing. So if you run into problems, don't think, oh my God, I'm the only one who can't figure this out. No, you're not. A lot of people have a hard time setting this up right. So don't be afraid to ask. Join us on Slack, join the testing channel, give us your input, and tell us what's going wrong. And people there will try to help you out because they know what it's like. So one of the most important parts is the PHP Unit Xml. Don't go into too much depth trying to read this. What I mostly want to show you is that the documentation is there once you open this. What you need to set in your PHP Unit XML are the environmental variables that PHP Unit needs to run its tests. And as you can see, if you just take a look, even just the first 2 lines, there's always an example and then the actual setting of the environmental variable. So setting those variables to whatever is appropriate for your local setup is what you need to do to get started. And especially for running the lower level type tests like unit tests, that's pretty much all you need. All the other input and environmental variables are mostly for JavaScript testing. So look at that documentation. Once you've set that up, you're going to want to run your tests. So running your tests for Drupal you can do that in 3 ways, really. The first one is just use PHP Unit directly, which after you've done your composer install is going to be in vendor/bin/PHP Unit. And then you can just add the path to the test that you want to run. If you want to know more about running tests and running them directly with PHP Unit, just look at the PHP Unit documentation. You don't need to go looking for Drupal documentation on it. There is some there, but since you're running PHP Unit directly, you're better off just looking at PHP Unit documentation. So if you want to go a little bit further, if you're using an IDE, I use PHP Storm. So if you use that, you can set that up as well to run it directly from your IDE. In my case, if you do it in PHP Storm, you configure PHP Unit in preferences, and you need to do some settings. Just Google about it, and you'll find what you need about how to set that up. And that will just, once you look at your code, it will show you a little green triangle next to your test method. You can run it straight from there. So for me, that's how I set it up because it's the easiest way to do it. But some setups don't necessarily facilitate this. So that all depends. There's one more that I'd like to mention, but not recommend using. You can run your tests like the Drupal test bot using a script called runtest.sh. But it's mostly used for the test bot. And since most of the tests that we run now are PHP Unit based, you're better off just doing directly from PHP Unit. The test bot needed this when it tried to run simple tests as well, and PHP Unit. And PHP Unit doesn't do concurrency, so it needs it for that. But mostly only use this when you're running into problems where the test bot is giving you different results than you get locally when you just use PHP Unit. So I really just want to mention it that it's a possibility, but don't recommend actually using it. That's unfortunately the most of the things that I can say about setting up. Since it's so personal, there's all sorts of ways to go around it, but really this is just something you have to go through with your personal setup and get it running. Like I said, just try running a core test. Once it's green, you know your setup's good, at least for that type of test. So it takes a little effort to get going. For some people, it's simple. For some people, it's really hard. It just depends on your setup. So now that you have a setup running, you want to start writing. But before you start writing tests, you need to know what type of tests you're going to need. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through all the different tests that are available and point out their strengths and weaknesses. So you can make an educated choice when you start to know where to start, because it's all about finding the right test to use to start with. So most of the tests that are in core now are based on PHP Unit. And what we have there is unit testing, which is just straight up unit testing, which we're going to look at first. There's a thing called a kernel test, which is a pure Drupalism, but still sort of a unit test. And we have some functional testing using a browser, and it always uses a minimal clean install of Drupal. So every time you run a test, it will install Drupal again. And then there's the functional JavaScript tests that also run always run on a clean install of Drupal, and you can use them either with PHP, and then it's PHP Unit, or you can use it writing JavaScript, and then you would use Nightwatch. I'm not going to go into too much of Nightwatch since it's a completely different beast, and you could spend an hour just talking about that. I'm just letting you know that it's there, and if you're not really a PHP developer and more of a JavaScript developer, there is Nightwatch available for you to use. So the first type of test that we're going to look at is just the lowest level of testing that you can use is just a straight up unit test. For Drupal, you would extend unit test case, and you can use it pretty much as any other unit test. And it's not really Drupal specific. It's a little bit Drupal specific, and when we're going to look at code a little later, you'll see some of the little Drupalisms that got introduced for it, just to make working with it a little easier when you're using Drupal. And the use of the unit test is just to test pure code. You're going to test one method on one class, and you're going to test that in total isolation just to make sure that that one method does what it needs to do. That's what unit testing is for. Just isolate everything, and if it has a dependency on something else, you mock it, you make a fake version of it, and you inject that using dependency injection or something along those lines, and so that you can totally test it in isolation. If you want to look at documentation for that, just go to phpunit.de. It's not Drupal specific. You can find some Drupal specific stuff about it, and you can look at Drupal specific documentation, but most of the documentation for it is just straight up PHP Unit. And so you're much better off just looking at that documentation, which is much more extensive. The tests are really, really fast. So that's what makes them a very good baseline, because you can do a lot of testing in a short time. They're great for testing all possible combination of parameters on your method. It's really easy to just feed your method different combinations and see if it keeps working. It's great for testing object-oriented code. And it's great when you have a limited number of dependencies, because like I pointed out, you need to mock all your dependencies. You have to make fake versions of it. Unfortunately, a lot of Drupal code doesn't fit these criteria. We have a lot of dependencies. We still have non-object-oriented code floating around in Drupal. So that's why the Drupal community invented the kernel test, which is a pure Drupalism. It doesn't exist outside of Drupal. If you want to use it, you're going to extend kernel test based. And what it is, it's basically a unit test, except that you have a filled container and you have a database available. So some of those dependencies you no longer need to mock, or any of the dependencies, if you use proper dependency injection and it's a service you're testing or something like that, it should just be available with all its dependencies. So it breaks proper PHP unit isolation, because you're no longer testing your code in isolation. You're testing your code on an integration level, because you're no longer mocking your dependencies, but you're just using your real dependencies. They're still pretty quick, but they install modules. You can install a module in a kernel test, and it needs to bootstrap a database, and it needs to fill the container from the modules that you've enabled. So they're nowhere near as quick as just a straight up PHP unit test or a unit test. It installs the modules, like I said, but it does in a very minimal way. So it tries to keep its quickness by not installing everything, which does mean that if you want to use part of your module, you might have to install stuff that you're not normally used to installing. Stuff like a config schema or entity types aren't installed by a kernel test. You need to do that manually. You need to do that in your setup for your test. So that takes a little getting used to, where you normally would just go, oh, install this module, I have everything available. For a kernel test, that's not true. You still need to specify which parts of your module you want to install. So when we use kernel tests, it's still great for object-oriented code, but when mocking all your dependencies, it's just not feasible. Either it's not possible, or it's just there's too many of them, which is unfortunately true for a fair bit of Drupal core code. They're great for testing hook implementations. Why? Because the .module files in your module are automatically included. And in the end, once you get comfortable with them, they're really good for testing anything that doesn't require a browser. When you do require a browser, that's where browser test base comes in. It's pure functional testing. It has a very slow setup time. Why? Because it needs to bootstrap an entire clean install of Drupal every time you run a test. So that takes a while. If you've ever installed Drupal, you know installing Drupal takes a bit. So since it does that for every test method, the setup is fairly slow. But once you've done that, you have that Drupal site available for you to test against. And you can test it using a browser. The interaction with the browser and the interaction with the pages is done through Mink. So again, if you want to look at documentation, there is some available on Drupal.org. But since we're using Mink, you're better off. Usually when you go deep dive and you want to find out something, how to test a specific page interaction, just look at the Mink documentation. Or at least don't restrict your Googling to just Drupal, also include Mink. Because a lot of the answers you're going to find are not really Drupal related at all. You only use these types of tests because they're so slow to set up when you actually need a browser to test something. You know, filling forms, rendering, anything you need a browser for. Although it can be hard to test stuff just through code. So if you have some steps to reproduce that you can reproduce in your browser, just click through something to reproduce a bug. A browser test is a good default to go through because you have the steps to reproduce. If you can reproduce them in an automated test, you should be able to reproduce your bug. So in that respect, they're a good fallback anyway. So the layer on top of that is JavaScript testing. The core class for that is WebDriver Test Base. And this uses PHP to test JavaScript. So it has the same slow setup because it still needs to install a fresh install Drupal, same as the browser test because it's just built on top of that. And it also has to bootstrap a browser. In the case of Drupal.org, it's Chrome. Locally, I always use Chrome. But you can, if you want to, use other browsers. And you only want to do this when you need to test something that needs a browser and on top of that needs JavaScript support. So some of the examples that I have are like something like the Views UI or Views Ajax functionality, contextual links, and quick edit. Some of these things, stuff like the Views UI, can actually be tested without JavaScript because they have a non-JavaScript version available. But if you want to really test how the users use it, then you're going to need this because of all JavaScript involved in most browser interactions. So that's a lot of information about tests. And we have one more, which is the non-PHP Unit version. It's Nightwatch, and that's for testing JavaScript with JavaScript. For documentation, just check out the Nightwatch documentation itself. It can use a browser when needed, but you can also write unit tests for JavaScript in it. None of them have landed so far in Drupal core. I have a couple of issues open where we're trying it. It works, but most of the time people will just use the PHP versions. So there's not a lot of Nightwatch tests yet. It has a lot of elaborate setup and teardown still. Quite a lot of the scaffolding that you need to set up stuff is done for the PHP versions, and here every test needs quite a lot of scaffolding still. So it's a little bit more elaborate to set. So that was a lot of information. So when you boil it down, you come down to this. This is an oversimplification, but when you want to try to find the right test to start using, and you want to start writing something, it'll give you a bit of an insight if you just follow the flowchart. First of all, you need to ask yourself, do I need a test? And the answer is always yes. If you're working on core, the answer is always yes, you need a test. And then what you need to know is, do I need a browser? And if it's yes, then you need to know, do I need to use JavaScript? Yes or no? If it's no, you can go for a browser test. If it's yes, but do you like using PHP? Then you could probably use a WebDriver test. And if the answer is no, you want to go to no. So those are fairly easy steps to take, and it will lead you to a good base to start from. If you don't need a browser, if it's something pure code-based, then you want to look at, do I have a lot of dependencies? If yes, yeah, probably use a kernel test. It's easier. If no, do you have any static calls in the code you want to test? If yes, probably use a kernel test again. Static calls are hard to mock. They're annoying to mock. It can be done, but why go through the hassle? You can use a kernel test to start with. If you're using any global functions, same, they're hassle to mock. So if yes, just use a kernel test. It's easier. If it's no, then you can probably start out with a unit test. These are guidelines. These are not hard. You need to do this. Just sort of to get you moving, to have something that you can start with. Because once you start writing, then you know where to look. You know what kind of examples you need to look for, and just to help you get going. So now we want to start writing because we know which type of test we want to write. And we have our setup ready, so we can write something, and then we can actually see if it works. So the first question is, does this need a test? And yes, seriously, everything in core needs a test. It just does. Wow. I exaggerate, of course, but any bug definitely needs a test. How does it work for Drupal core? If you have a bug, the way that you show that you actually have a bug currently in Drupal core is you write an automated test for it, and just the test, and you post that on Drupal.org, and your test should fail. These are the test-only patches that you see on Drupal.org. They're there to show you that currently head has a bug, and that you have written a test that illustrates that bug, that shows that the bug. And then you add a patch that has both the test and the fix. And then you show, okay, so I've shown there was a bug, and I've shown you now that I have a fix because hopefully the test that you've written is now green. So that's how it works for bugs. For features, it's a little harder, but because you can't do a test-only patch, because that would always fail because your feature isn't there yet, so there's nothing there to do. But any feature needs full coverage of all logic. It's just a requirement. Otherwise, they're not going to add it to core. If you write hook updates or hook post updates, they need an upgrade path test to write to show that your upgrade works. If you go from state A to state B, that your upgrade does what it's supposed to do and that it keeps working. Those are really annoying to write, by the way. In case you ever need to write one, they're really hard. And everything needs 100% coverage. If you have 2 ifs in the code that you're testing, you probably need at least 2 test cases because you want to hit all the ifs. You want to hit all the lines of code. So if you're reviewing a patch and somebody has like massive if statement and they have 1 test case for it, you can probably knock it back to needs to work because it doesn't have enough test coverage. So test coverage is very important for Drupal. So is there anything that doesn't actually need a test? Well, some stuff just isn't testable. If you're updating doc blocks, for example, it doesn't need a test. If you're doing CSS changes, currently it doesn't need a test either. And UI text sometimes needs a test, sometimes it doesn't. If there's any logic involved in showing the UI text, then it probably needs a test. If there's no logic involved, then maybe not. But on a general principle, whenever you post something on Drupal.org, if it doesn't have a test, then it's not getting in. When you start writing, when it's time to start writing. So there's a little bit of Dutch here that says, beter goed gejat dan slecht bedacht. And the closest I could get with imitation is the sincerest form of flattery in English. Basically what it says is, find a similar scenario and steal it. Just copy, paste, and copy some more. That's how you start writing tests. Just find something that does what you sort of think that you need to do, and then copy and paste it. And then copy and paste some other stuff that also does what you need and combine it into something that runs. That's how you start. That's what you start with. And most of the things have been done before. The chances that you're working on a scenario that's completely new, yeah, the odds aren't that high. And always remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. You're going to go through rounds of reviews. If you have a test that demonstrates a bug and it's not perfect, nobody cares. Everybody's going to be so happy that you actually made an effort to write a test. They'll just give you feedback and say, oh, we could change this, we could change that. But everybody's going to be so thrilled that you actually wrote a test for something. So don't try to be perfect. Don't let perfect be the enemy of not even good, but just sufficient to show that you can demonstrate that the bug actually exists. So what it comes down to, if you want to copy stuff, you need to be able to find existing coverage. So this is exactly what I see in the chat right now. Whether or not I have any pointers on how to steal your code. So this is really hard. Since there's no hard connection and no clear indication which test coverage is for which code, it makes it really hard to find. If you're testing a class, seriously, just add test.php to the end of the class name and see if it exists. Because probably it does. Because it's not a hard naming convention, but it's just, people. It's an easy naming convention, and people are lazy. So why come up with something harder than that? And oftentimes you will actually find what you're looking for. And search for the method name that you're working on. Make sure that you're only searching in test.php files, since all PHP unit tests are going to end in test.php. So use a file mask. Make sure you only search for that. But it is hard. It is. It's hard for me. I've gone through, I don't know how many lines of test code, and I still don't always know where to find what. But again, any test is better than nothing. So I've often seen that somebody posts a test, they post a completely new test, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, we could just add this to this and this test case, which does something similar. And that's fine, because everybody's going to be so happy you wrote a test. You can refactor it later. So in other words, don't worry too much about it. So it's great for the stealing, but that's mostly for setup. So how do I set up an entity type? How do I go to a page? How do I click on a button? And you just look at the same sort of test type that you're writing. So that's why it's really important to first find what type of test do I need to write. And after that, look around in some tests. The best documentation on testing is existing test coverage. There's not a lot of point in looking at documentation on Drupal.org. Once you start writing, look in other tests in the same module of the same type, and just look around and see what you can find. I wish there was an easier way to do it. I wish there was a better connection between the two, but there isn't. Even after this, if you're still unsure, start with a browser test. Why? Every issue on Drupal.org should have steps to reproduce. Those steps to reproduce are usually stuff that you can do through the UI. And if you just follow those steps, but in a browser test, you should be able to duplicate the bug. So that's, if you really have no idea where to start, just start clicking through a page. Open up the front page and go from there. Go to a URL, start from there. Start clicking and try to reproduce the steps to reproduce, except in an automated test. That's always a good way to start it. As I told you, with all the test types, it's maybe not the most efficient way to work. But again, if you can demonstrate a bug with any sort of automated test, everybody's going to be so thrilled that you managed to do that. The optimization will come either later or it won't come at all, and they'll just be happy with what you've done. So we're going to look at some code now. All of the examples that I have now are from the examples module. So if you want to look along, I'm just highlighting some of the stuff that I found in there. So you can read up on that later. There's a submodule called a testing example that has a fair number of examples, everything except JavaScript test and either PHP or Nightwatch. They're both not there. but they're good examples. They have a lot of explanation next to it, a lot of code comments. So look through that just in order to get going. So this is what a unit test looks like. It's a lot of code, but not that much. So the first thing I want to point out for a unit test is something called a data provider. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth later, but the method above this is the actual data provider. And then on your test method, you say data provider and then the name of the method. This will make sure that your test gets run with all the lines from your data provider individually. If you look at the right-hand side in the test results, you can see that this test was run 6 times, once for every entry in your data provider. So they're really powerful tool to test your code with all sorts of different data sets and see if it works for all those data sets. I said unit tests were pure unit tests based on PHP Unit, but of course, Drupal being Drupal, it did a little bit of layer of Drupal in there as well. So what you usually do in a unit test, you just instantiate the class you're testing. So that's the second line here where the controller gets instantiated, and it gets instantiated using dependency injection. And what it injects here is something that it gets from Drupal, namely get string translation stub. This is when you're unit testing stuff where you're using the T method. And since quite a lot of code in Drupal does that, they've written a little helper that allows it to be easily mocked. What's still very important is that it's still mocked. It's fake. And the only reason we can test our contrived controller is because it uses dependency injection. If you're not using dependency injection, if you're using something like /Drupal and then using methods from that, you won't be able to mock anything. So that's why we use dependency injection. Dependency injection is just a pattern to use for unit testing. And this is where you see where it actually gets used inside a unit test. So some more trickery being done because we want to test the hand count method here. And the hand count method isn't actually public. So you can instantiate your class, but you can't actually call the method. So you're going to need to do some trickery to get to this protected method, which is use reflection method and then set it to public. So we can actually test our method. There's multiple ways of doing this, but this is one example of trying to work around some of the setups in your, or one of the restrictions in your classes. So this is a pure unit test. As you can see, on the right-hand side, this runs the same test 6 times, and it does so in 45 milliseconds. So it's really fast. And you can get a lot of coverage done. But as you can see, the contrived controller only has one dependency. So that makes it easy, especially since it's a dependency where we have a stub available straight from Drupal. So if you have 5 or 6 dependencies here, the setup is going to be much more elaborate. And that's where we're going to get to for kernel tests and what the problem that they solve. So a little bit more on data providers, because I think they're a really powerful tool. They're really good to use. And since everything is based on PHP Unit for all at least the PHP tests, you can use them in all types of tests. So whether it's a functional test or unit test, you can always use a data provider. But what you need to know is that the setup method is run every time for each data point. And in browser test setup, it's really expensive because it has to do a setup of a clean Drupal install. So you don't want to really use them for anything for a browser test or a functional JavaScript test because it becomes really expensive to do. So instead of the second run taking 1 millisecond, it's going to take another 30 seconds to do it. Same goes for new test methods. Every time you have a new test method, it's going to run setup again. So you really want to think about that when you're writing a browser test. can I integrate my test with within an existing test method? Because it'll save the Drupal test bot, 30 seconds to spin it up again. So it's a really powerful tool, data providers. But again, for Drupal, use it only in unit tests, in kernel tests, and please don't use them for browser testing. So here we're going to see some of an example from a kernel test, and some of the weirdness that comes with it. So what I didn't copy paste from this is that you can just set a certain amount of modules that you want to install. So in this case, the node module and the user module get installed, maybe something like filter. But because it's so minimal, you need to install lots of other stuff yourself. So if you actually want to create a node, you're going to have to install the schema for nodes. And that's the entity schema, but you also want to check access, so you have to install the node access schema. Same for user data. You need to set that up all in your setup method, because it's been so minimally installed. So it's not just it's not an install you could normally do through the UI. So here you see some of the examples that you need to do: install schema, install entity schema, and install config. But once you've done that, you have a full Drupal setup available. So you can do something like create user and just, bam, you have a user. There's no need to mock anything. There's no need to make stubs or anything like that. You can just create a user. So the test that's in the examples module for that is just node creation. So it works basically the same as the user create. You can just create a node, and then you can do an assertion on that, check whether or not the node got a title, and that's all there is to it. So it takes a bit more effort to set up, but you have much more freedom in what you want to test. And in the end, the setup compared to if you wanted to do this in a unit test is still a lot less. But as you can see, if you look at the test result, the bottom right-hand corner, it takes almost 3 seconds to run. And it's not a particularly elaborate test. So it has quite a lot of overhead. We go from like 40 milliseconds to almost 3 full seconds. So there is a bit of overhead. It's still very quick, but it's nowhere near as quick as running a straight up unit test. So here are the things. I highlighted them. Okay. So those are the things that you can see there. So the next level is going to be a functional test. A functional test, you don't have to do anything. You just have a Drupal site available to you once it's done setting up. But like I said, the setup is fairly heavy. So, but once you have that, you can do stuff like Drupal login. You can log in a user. And you can first create a user. So on the fly, you could create a user, you log them in, and then you can just go to a URL. In this case, it goes to the home path, just using a Drupal get. And then it does something called assert session, which gets a lot of asserts on it. And then you can test whether or not a link exists on your page. So setup-wise, when you're writing the test, you don't have to set up a lot of stuff manually because all that scaffolding is done for you. But if you look at the right-hand side, the test result, it shows you that on my local machine, it took almost 25 seconds to run. So we suddenly go from like 3 seconds to 25 seconds to run. So there's a lot of overhead in bootstrapping a test like this. So if you can limit it, please limit it, because the DA has to pay for all these tests that are getting run. So try to be optimal. So you get a lot for free if you use a browser test. These are great to start with. If you want to learn how to write tests, browser tests, even though they're heavy, you get so much set up for you. It's much closer to what you're used to working with. when you're just writing Drupal code, because you have a full Drupal site available to you. Then we get to functional JavaScript tests. This is not one from the examples module, but just one that I stole from Drupal core. And the most important thing there is you have everything available to you that you have available in your browser test, but you have to wait a lot. So when you're doing testing using JavaScript, you have to wait for everything to load, because your JavaScript runs and then something changes on the page. I can't stress enough how much you have to wait. When you're writing JavaScript tests, the one thing you're going to run into is that you don't wait enough, because the browser that's testing it's light speed. So where normally if something will load in the time it takes you to move your mouse from A to B, it's going to take the testing browser a hell of a lot less time than that. So you're going to have to wait, and you're going to have to wait a lot. And it's not always clear what you're waiting for. But that's the most important thing that I can point out about JavaScript testing is wait. And then you wait some more, and then you click something, and then you have to wait. It's all about the waiting. But as you can see here, so here there's a method that I highlighted, which says wait for element count. There are a lot of wait methods available to you. All that scaffolding that you need, all the tooling that you need to wait for stuff is available in Drupal core. So you can wait for an element to show up. You can wait for an element to disappear. I think that landed anyway. I'm not sure if the element count is actually in core, but there are examples of that. You can wait for fields to appear. So there's a lot of waiting going on, but you should have the tooling available to do that. But that's one of the main things that where you get differences between a local machine and the test bot, where the test bot is even faster than your local machine would be, where, you know, if you have to wait for 2 or 3 milliseconds on my local machine, it'll just be done before it gets to the next line of code. The test bot runs on a much stronger machine than my local machine, so it'll be even faster, so you need to do more waiting. Okay, so that was it for what I really wanted to show you and to just help you get going, starting to write tests. I could do a whole talk on actually writing tests, but I'm not going to do it here. This is just to get you going. Start writing a test. Just set something up and start writing it. Just random stuff I learned from doing things, and just mostly to illustrate points that you're going to run into. Once you get into testing and you start making these tests, you're going to run into weird stuff. One of the first things I ran into was that the test bot on Drupal.org actually runs in a subdirectory, and not everybody knows that. And locally, most people don't run inside a subdirectory, but they just run it on the root. So if you're testing for something and you're testing for the validity of something like a URL, it's easy to just add a slash at the beginning because, you know, that's your base path. But it's not the base path on Drupal, on the test bot, so your test will fail. And you're going to go, well, it works locally. Yeah, not so much on the test bot. So there's differences between how you run it locally and the test bot. And occasionally it'll throw up an error where you go, but it works locally. Well, this is one of the things that can happen. Same goes for namespacing. Php Unit really doesn't care about namespacing when you run a test. But if you get the namespacing wrong on your test, the test bot is not going to find it, or it's going to throw up an error that, you know, it found the initial test, but it can't actually run it. So those are little things that you need to pay attention to that will not show up on your local testing. I illustrated the kernel tests that they're weirdly minimal, and if you're using them and it's for some reason it's not working, you probably forgot to set something up. It can be really hard to track down what you forgot to set up, but usually that's the case. And that's one of the harder points with working with kernel tests, being able to find out what you need to set up. Like I said, JavaScripts are all about waiting, but there's one catch-all wait method called assert wait for AJAX request, and never ever use that, please. I have to say that I'm mostly at fault for getting it into Drupal core, and I wish we never did it, because it's a catch-all that doesn't catch everything. It's responsible for a lot of random fails on Drupal.org. There's a lot of other weighting methods available now. Please use those. Don't try to use the catch-all. It's easier because you don't have to think about what you're waiting for. But like I said, it causes quite a lot of failures. So don't use it. If you're using browser test based and you want to look at using your browser to look at responses, it only works for HTML responses. So if you're testing XML or JSON replies, it's not going to work. It's not going to find anything. It'll tell you that the page is empty because it's looking for an HTML tag, which you're not going to find. So there's other ways to work with other types of responses, which I'm not going to get into right now. So if you're interested in that, ask me later. But don't be surprised by that browser testing is just for HTML responses. The next thing is mostly for people working on views. That be me. But it's also to illustrate a point about databases. Drupal core has, out of the box, it supports 3 different databases. But they don't always work exactly the same. So Postgres doesn't do the same default sorting as MySQL. So if you have a test depending on default sorting, it probably fails on Postgres. So if you're messing with a database layer or something like that, and messing with queries, make sure to run your tests on Drupal.org on different databases as well, not just MySQL. I've broken head with that many times. So they tend to sneak through anyway. And then they have to roll it back and stuff like that. So try to remember, if you're messing with databases, set it up with the other databases as well. And when you've been away from testing for a bit, Chrome driver nowadays, that's what you use to run your JavaScript tests. It updates with every major Chrome release. It didn't used to be the case when we started using Chrome driver for Drupal core. It just had one release that worked for all major releases of Chrome. But unfortunately, nowadays, that's no longer true. So be sure to keep your Chrome driver up to date as well. Otherwise, you're going to get really weird messages and your test will fail. And what you're going to learn is that error reporting for when your test setup doesn't work is not always as clear as it could be. Okay, so now what? What can you do if you feel like, okay, I want to start doing something with this? What's next? Well, first of all, you need to set up your system to run tests. Just grab a core test and see if you can get that green locally. That's a massive step in the right direction. You can look at the examples module like I did. I showed you a couple of things, but there's much more there. And if you really want to start learning about this, the only way to start learning about this is by starting to write tests. If you write a test and you post it on Drupal.org, people will review it and you get feedback. And that feedback, that's where you learn. There's people out there with so much knowledge that they love sharing, but if you don't put anything up, they're not gonna ever look at your code, and you're not gonna learn from that knowledge. Just grab an issue that says needs tests. There are about 1,000 of them in the issue queue for Drupal core, so plenty to choose from. And like I said, if you find a test that has steps to reproduce, a good first step is just building a browser test and reproducing those steps in your test and see if it fails. But there's plenty to start from, and a lot of them have fixes but don't have tests. And this is a major blocker for a lot of issues, because people are not comfortable writing tests for some reason or another. So it really helps get rid of a bottleneck if you start help writing those tests. If you have questions, join us in the Drupal Slack in the testing channel. Or if you want to work on core bugs, join us for the Bug Smash initiative, also on Drupal Slack in the Bug Smash channel. There's people there that want to help you fix bugs in Drupal core. And like I said, one of the major points of fixing bugs in Drupal core, the reason why bugs stay open is because they don't get testing. So those are some steps you can think about. And that's it for me. So I hope you learned something. And if there's any questions, give a shout out here in chat, or find me either on Drupal Slack or here at the event. And ask me anything you want about testing. But thank you. Okay, no questions, then thanks a lot for coming. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the issue queue or on Drupal Slack, and see you around.